The air in Heidelberg was unnervingly still on that April afternoon in 1945. The medieval towers that had stood for centuries, the cobblestones polished by generations of footsteps, all now seemed to echo, with only one sound, the distant thunder of tanks. Somewhere beyond the hills, the American army was advancing, and the ancient city waited, holding its breath. From a cramped second-floor apartment, Greta Miller pressed her face against the window pane. She was 26 years old, but in the harsh light of war, she carried the weight of a woman twice that age. Her hair, once thick and full, was tied hastily in a bun. Her eyes ringed with exhaustion. Around her sat 6 other women, their faces drawn with the same mixture of fear and hunger. Their gazes locked on the empty street below, as if at any moment it would erupt with chaos. "They're here," whispered Anna Schaefer, clutching a faded photograph of her husband who had died at Stalingrad. Her voice cracked as she spoke, and the others instinctively drew closer together. They had been listening for days, listening to the rumors carried westward by streams of refugees. Stories of what happened when armies swept into towns. And more frightening still were the whispered warnings of Nazi officials as they fled. Dire predictions of brutality, of vengeance unleashed upon German women by men with guns and no mercy. Greta tried to speak calmly, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Remember what we agreed. We stay together. We don't go out alone." Her voice wavered as she stopped herself from finishing the unspoken. "And if they come for us?" The words hung in the air without being said. The women nodded, the silence around them heavier than the walls. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted the Americans as little more than savages in uniform, lawless conquerors who would ravage their way through cities. And if anyone doubted it, the horrifying tales coming from the East confirmed the possibility. There, under the Red Army's advance, hundreds of thousands of German women had been assaulted in what would become one of the darkest legacies of the war's end. To the women in Heidelberg, it seemed impossible to believe that things could be different once their own city fell. Marie Hoffmann, barely 19, whispered the thought none of them dared voice. What if they force us to accommodate them? The room froze, her words a dagger piercing the already suffocating tension. Greta forced herself to straighten her shoulders. She wanted to appear braver than she felt. "Because someone had to. Then we will face it together," she replied firmly. "We are German women. We will maintain our dignity, no matter what." But the courage in her voice was borrowed, fragile. Every woman in the room knew what conquest usually meant. Every woman feared that survival would come at the cost of something far greater than their pride. A knock at the door shattered the silence. Not a pounding, not a boot forcing its way through, just a sharp, deliberate knock. The women froze like frightened birds. Then a man's voice came through the wood, speaking German with a heavy accent. "Ladies, this is Sergeant Thompson, United States Army. Please open the door. We need to conduct a security check." For Greta, the words felt like the end. Her hands trembled as she reached for the handle. Her friends huddled behind her, clutching one another in mute terror. This was it, the moment they had dreaded for weeks. The sound of tanks was no longer distant. The war was no longer outside their walls. It was here, at their very doorstep. With a deep breath, Greta opened the door. There, instead of the snarling conquerors she had imagined, stood 3 American soldiers. Their uniforms were clean, their rifles held at their sides, and at once the tallest of them, Sergeant Thompson, removed his helmet, bowing his head in respect. His eyes were not cruel, but calm, even kind. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I'm sorry to disturb you. We are conducting building searches for German military personnel. May we come in?" Greta blinked, disoriented by the words. She had prepared herself for shouting, for orders barked at gunpoint, for violence. Instead, this soldier had asked permission. The thought seemed absurd, even dangerous, like a trick to lower their guard. Still, her voice cracked as she answered, "Of course." The soldiers entered with deliberate care, their rifles lowered, their eyes carefully avoiding the women huddled in the corner. They searched quickly but respectfully closets, under beds, inside cupboards. They touched nothing unnecessary, disturbed no personal items. The women held their breath, waiting for the moment when the facade would drop. But it never came. When the search was complete, Sergeant Thompson paused at the door and spoke again. "Ma'am, for your safety, I recommend staying indoors for the next few days. There may be confusion while order is established, but you'll be safe here." Greta's voice was barely above a whisper as she asked, What do you plan to do with us?" The American's brow furrowed, confusion in his expression. "Do with you? Nothing. Ma'am, you're civilians. We'll be setting up a military government, restoring services. That's all." And with that, the soldiers were gone. The women sat in stunned silence, as though the air itself had been pulled from the room. "They didn't even look at us," Anna whispered, incredulous. But Greta remained cautious. She had seen enough in war to know that appearances could deceive. This might still be a trap, a tactic to lull them into a false sense of security. The real test, she thought, would come in the days ahead. And as the sound of American tanks rolled deeper into the city, Greta realized she and the women of Heidelberg stood at the threshold of something entirely unknown. Their fears of the conquerors remained, but so too did a fragile, dangerous seed of hope. Hope that perhaps this occupation would not unfold as they had been told, and that the future could yet surprise them. The fear that gripped Greta Miller and the women of Heidelberg in April 1945 was not born overnight. It was the product of years of propaganda, whole months of devastation, and centuries of inherited memory about what conquest meant. To understand why their hands trembled at the knock on the door, one must step back into the broader landscape of a Germany collapsing under the weight of total war. By the spring of 1945, the Reich was finished. The Allies were advancing on all fronts. From the west came the Americans, British, and French, sweeping through the Rhineland and into the heart of the country. From the east came the Red Army, relentless and vengeful after the unimaginable losses of the Soviet people. Cities lay in rubble. Cologne, Dresden, Frankfurt scarred landscapes of fire and stone. Millions of civilians lived in cellars and ruins, clinging to scraps of food while air raid sirens still howled overhead. For German civilians, defeat was no longer a possibility, it was a certainty. But the question that haunted them was, what kind of defeat would it be? The Nazi regime, even in its death throes, had poisoned the minds of its citizens with warnings about the enemy. Propaganda ministers filled newspapers, radios, and posters with images of Americans as beasts, barbaric soldiers with no restraint, ready to plunder, humiliate, and destroy. Special attention was paid to German women, who were told they would be the first victims once the Americans set foot in their towns. Better dead than dishonored, one campaign urged, fueling both terror and fatalism. But propaganda alone cannot explain the depth of fear. Real events made those warnings believable. To the east, where the Red Army had crossed into German territory, atrocities were already being whispered about in horrified tones. In Königsberg, Silesia, and East Prussia, hundreds of thousands of women had been assaulted by Soviet soldiers. The accounts filtered westward, with streams of refugees, stories of entire villages brutalized, of families shattered, of women of every age from teenagers to grandmothers attacked. Whether the numbers were exaggerated or not, the impact was devastating. The mere mention of advancing soldiers triggered panic. Thus, when the people of Heidelberg heard that an army was coming, they did not distinguish between Soviet and American. In their minds, all invaders were the same. They expected the same nightmare to repeat itself. Yet the situation on the Western Front was profoundly different. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, had issued clear and uncompromising orders. American soldiers were forbidden from fraternizing with German civilians. Discipline was to be absolute. Looting, mistreatment of civilians, or any form of assault would be punished harshly. This was not merely a matter of moral conscience, it was strategic. The Allies had learned from the mistakes of the First World War. After 1918, harsh occupation policies and the crushing Treaty of Versailles had sown resentment in Germany, providing fertile ground for extremists like Hitler to rise. Eisenhower and his planners were determined not to repeat that cycle. This time, they envisioned a different kind of occupation, one that would break Nazism but allow ordinary Germans to rebuild their lives within a framework of democracy. Still, the orders on paper were one thing. How could civilians, who had only ever heard Nazi lies or refugee horror stories, believe that the approaching American tanks carried something other than ruin? To appreciate the contrast, one might look elsewhere. In Italy, after the fall of Mussolini, Allied troops had also faced the challenge of occupation. There, discipline varied widely. Some units maintained order. Others succumbed to the temptations of power. In France, German women accused of collaboration were publicly humiliated in the aftermath of liberation. Their heads shaved in the streets. Everywhere across Europe, war blurred the line between victor and victim, justice and vengeance. And yet, the American approach in Germany, especially in Heidelberg, was unique for its restraint. It was shaped not only by policy but also by circumstance. Heidelberg, unlike many other German cities, had largely been spared the bombing that obliterated places like Dresden or Hamburg. Its medieval heart remained intact, its university still standing. For American commanders, this made the city an ideal location for establishing administrative centers. They had every reason to keep order, protect infrastructure, and prevent chaos. For the women peering from their apartments, however, such strategic considerations were invisible. All they knew was the pounding of their hearts, the echo of tanks, the whispers of horror. To them, conquest meant humiliation, and the occupiers were faceless shadows, ready to strip away whatever dignity war had not already stolen. Greta Miller was part of a generation raised under the Nazi promise that Germany would never again know defeat. Now, faced with the reality of foreign soldiers at her door, she carried not only her own fear, but also the weight of her society's collapse. The terror in that apartment was not only about what might happen in the next hours, it was the culmination of 12 years of lies, 6 years of total war, and centuries of European memory that conquest was always paid for by women. That is why the politeness of Sergeant Thompson, the respectful search of the Americans, and their calm departure without violence felt so utterly surreal. It was not just unexpected, it was unthinkable. It ran against everything they had been told, everything history had prepared them for. And in that gulf between expectation and reality lay the seed of a remarkable transformation, one that would define not just the lives of Greta and her companions, but the entire relationship between defeated Germany and its American occupiers. The knock at the door had been the beginning of a story no one in that apartment could have predicted. A story not of conquest, but of restraint, not of humiliation, but of dignity, not of perpetual enemies, but of unlikely allies. The morning after the Americans arrived, the streets of Heidelberg echoed with new rhythms. Instead of the pounding of artillery or the shriek of air raid sirens, there was the steady rumble of jeeps, the bark of English commands at intersections, and the hum of an unfamiliar order being established. For the first time in years, the city was not under German control. Greta had hardly slept. The memory of Sergeant Thompson at her door played over in her mind like a riddle she could not solve. His words had been respectful, his men restrained. It was the opposite of everything she had expected. But was it a trick? Propaganda. After all, was not just a Nazi tool. Could this politeness be nothing more than a mask? Soon to be discarded. Inside her apartment, the women still spoke in whispers, their nerves taut. They will show their true faces soon, Anna muttered, clinging to suspicion like armor. They just want us calm until we cannot resist. Marie, younger and more desperate, argued back. But they didn't touch us. Anna, they didn't even look at us. The debate raged quietly, with Greta caught between both voices. Her heart told her to hope, her head warned her to fear. 3 days passed before necessity forced action. Food was nearly gone. The bread ration had dwindled to crumbs, and the thin soup Greta managed to stretch could no longer sustain 7 women. Hunger was more dangerous than soldiers. At last, Greta volunteered to step outside. The streets she entered were transformed. American soldiers stood at corners, their uniforms crisp, their movements brisk but orderly. They directed carts, calmed arguments at intersections, and maintained traffic with a businesslike detachment. What shocked Greta most was what she didn't see. There was no looting, no wild mobs, no soldiers tearing through homes. Civilians, though cautious, walked freely. "Excuse me, ma'am," came a voice behind her. She stiffened and turned. A young American soldier stood there, smiling nervously, his German halting but clear. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but she forced herself to stay. "Are you looking for the food distribution center?" he asked, pointing toward the town square. "2 blocks that way. They are giving rations to all civilians. No charge." Greta blinked. "Rations. For Germans." "Yes, ma'am. Army policy. We feed everyone in occupied areas. Can't have people starving. That only makes more trouble." It was said so matter-of-factly, as if it were obvious, natural. Yet for Greta it was as if the world had tilted on its axis. Soldiers feeding their enemies. She had to see it for herself. At the square, she found a scene that defied belief. American officers managed long lines of German civilians. Uniformed clerks worked beside German volunteers, recording names, addresses, and household sizes. Bread, canned meat, and even chocolate were distributed in orderly fashion. Soldiers helped elderly men carry bags. He guided lost children back to their parents. Even repaired a broken wagon wheel for a thankful farmer. When Greta's turn came, a sergeant with a clipboard asked, in broken German, "How many in your household?" 7. She replied hesitantly. "Women. Ages 19 to 40. 1. He calculated quickly, handed her a heavy canvas bag. 1 week. "Come back next Tuesday." She was still absorbing the moment when she overheard a conversation that made her stop. "Sergeant, some of the guys are asking about the local women," muttered a young corporal in English. The sergeant's face hardened. "And what did you tell them?" "That fraternization is strictly forbidden." "Sarge." "Damn right. General Eisenhower's orders are crystal clear. Any soldier caught with a German civilian faces court-martial. No exceptions. We're here to establish order, not disgrace the uniform." Greta hurried away, her mind whirling. If she had misunderstood Sergeant Thompson at her door, Here was proof beyond doubt. These men were not only refraining from abuse, they were forbidden from even casual relationships. She thought of the whispered warnings of Nazi officials, of Anna's unshakable suspicion. The truth unfolding before her eyes was utterly different. Back in the apartment, the women gathered as Greta unpacked the rations. Bread, canned goods, even coffee luxuries they had not tasted in months. They listened, wide-eyed, as she recounted what she had seen. They're organized, professional, feeding civilians, keeping order. She told them. She paused, struggling to find words for the part that mattered most. And they treat us with respect. Marie's eyes widened with hope. But surely they will take women. Sooner or later. Isn't that what conquerors always do? Greta shook her head firmly. I overheard them. Their sergeants forbid it. Not just as advice by order. The women exchanged glances of disbelief. For years they had been told that Americans were beasts in human form. Now they were faced with evidence that the opposite might be true. Anna, unwilling to surrender suspicion, whispered darkly, perhaps it is all a performance. They are waiting for us to let our guard down. But Greta, for the first time since the knock on her door, felt something stir in her chest. Not certainty, not trust, but possibility. A chance that this occupation might be unlike the horrors of the East, unlike the lessons history had taught them. What she did not know was that this fragile hope would soon be tested in the harshest way imaginable. Because even the strictest discipline cannot erase human weakness. And when one American soldier broke the rules, the fate of Heidelberg's fragile trust would hang in the balance. For 2 weeks, Heidelberg settled into a rhythm that felt almost surreal. The Americans patrolled with precision. Ration lines functioned smoothly, and order returned to streets that had known only chaos. Greta, still cautious, ventured out more often sometimes to collect food, sometimes to translate for neighbors who could not understand English. Each time, her dread ebbed a little more. The soldiers were firm but fair, and yet, beneath the surface, unease lingered. War was not tidy, and men with rifles were never free of temptation. The women in Greta's apartment reminded each other daily. Stay vigilant. Never be alone. Never assume safety. Then one evening, the illusion cracked. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. An American soldier had forced himself upon a German woman near the riverbank. The victim, a widow named Clara Becker, had been gathering water when the assault occurred. Soldiers nearby intervened, dragging the offender away. But the shock rippled through Heidelberg like wildfire. Inside Greta's apartment, silence fell as Anna's worst fears were confirmed. Do you see? She hissed, her face pale with vindication. I told you they would show their true nature. This is only the beginning. Greta's chest tightened. She wanted to believe the soldier was an exception, a crack in discipline rather than proof of betrayal. But history weighed heavily. Conquerors rarely punish their own for crimes against the defeated. She braced herself for the old cycle to repeat. Women violated, crimes ignored, terror becoming the new normal. The next morning, however, Heidelberg witnessed something no one expected. In the town square, American soldiers assembled in tight formation. Civilians gathered on the edges, wary but curious. On a raised platform stood Major Harrison, the local commander. His voice carried sharply across the crowd as he addressed his men. Yesterday, one of our soldiers disgraced this uniform. He assaulted a civilian woman of this city. Let there be no doubt. This is a crime. It is a crime against her, against the army, and against the honor of the United States. The soldier in question, shackled and stone-faced, stood before the crowd. An interpreter repeated every word in German so that civilians could understand. Gasps rose from the crowd as the charges were read aloud. This man will face court-martial. Major Harrison declared. And if convicted, he will be punished to the full extent of military law. Let all of you soldiers and civilians alike understand. The United States Army does not tolerate abuse. Not from its enemies, and certainly not from its own. The murmurs among the civilians swelled. Greta felt her throat tighten. She had expected silence, denial, or perhaps a quiet transfer of the offender to another unit. Instead, here was the conqueror's commander, publicly condemning one of his own before the eyes of the defeated. The soldier was led away, and Harrison's words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Around Greta, women exchanged glances of disbelief. Anna's lips parted, but no words came. Even she could not dismiss what they had just witnessed. Later that afternoon, Greta overheard two American officers speaking in English near the ration line. One was young, skeptical. "Sir, with respect, why humiliate us in front of the Germans? Couldn't this have been handled quietly?" Major Harrison's reply was firm. Because discipline must be seen as well as enforced. If the people believe we are wolves in uniform, they'll resist us at every turn. But if they see we uphold justice even for our enemies, they might learn to trust. Order depends on it. It was both practical and moral. Greta realized. The Americans were not saints. They were soldiers bound by policy and principle. But that was precisely what made it different. They were choosing restraint, even when they had the power to act otherwise. That night, as the women gathered in their apartment, the atmosphere was transformed. Clara Becker, though shaken, had been visited by American medical staff and assured compensation. Her attacker was awaiting trial. These were not the actions of conquerors drunk on victory. They were the actions of an army determined to prove that occupation could be something other than terror. Marie whispered what many of them were thinking. Perhaps they really are different. Greta did not answer immediately. She stared at the flickering candlelight, recalling the first knock on the door, the respectful searches, the ration lines, and now the public punishment of one of their own. Slowly, she allowed herself to say the words that once felt impossible. Yes, different. The fear that had once clung to them like a second skin did not vanish overnight, but it began to loosen its grip. For the first time, the women allowed themselves to imagine that survival in Heidelberg would not mean humiliation or degradation. Instead, it might mean dignity, even a fragile kind of partnership. And so, in that moment of reckoning when an army proved it could discipline itself as fiercely as it defeated others, the foundation of something extraordinary was laid. Not merely the survival of a city, but the birth of trust between enemies who might yet become allies. Weeks passed, and Heidelberg began to look less like a city under occupation and more like a city learning how to breathe again. The sight of American soldiers in the streets no longer sent civilians scurrying into doorways. Instead, people walked more confidently, greeting one another in hushed tones, clutching ration bags that promised survival. Greta found herself increasingly called upon to translate. She had studied English at the university before the war, and now her skill became invaluable. One morning, an American officer knocked not with the dreaded authority of a search, but with a request. "Miss Miller," he said, his words slow and careful. "We need someone who speaks English and German. Can you help?" Greta hesitated. To work with the occupiers risked whispers of betrayal. Yet hunger and curiosity outweighed fear. She agreed. At first, her tasks were simple: translating forms, assisting with ration lists, explaining instructions to townspeople. But gradually, her role deepened. She witnessed meetings where American officers outlined plans not for looting or punishment, but for restoration. Electricity would be restored. Schools would reopen, though textbooks filled with Nazi ideology would be removed. Civilians would be hired to clear rubble. repair bridges, and resume municipal services. What astonished Greta most was that women were central to these efforts. With so many men dead, captured, or missing, the Americans turned to women as clerks, teachers, translators, even organizers of local relief committees. Jobs once barred to women in the old Germany suddenly opened, not out of progressive philosophy but necessity. Yet the effect was undeniable. Greta and women like her gained voices in civic life that would have been unthinkable under the Reich. Her own transformation was quiet but profound. Each day she walked into the American administrative office. She was greeted with courtesy, treated as a partner rather than a subject. At first, she flinched whenever a soldier passed too close. But over time, her shoulders loosened. She began to see the soldiers not as faceless conquerors, but as young men, some no older than her students at the university, had once been exhausted, homesick, and bound by rules stricter than she imagined. One afternoon, as she translated for Major Harrison during a discussion about rebuilding the water supply, she caught herself thinking, "They are not here to destroy us. They are here to rebuild us." The thought unsettled her, not because it was frightening, but because it was liberating. For the women in her apartment, change was equally visible. Anna, who had once insisted the Americans would reveal their cruelty, found herself employed in a warehouse inventory office, receiving wages in Allied printed currency. Marie began helping at a school where American officers provided supplies and insisted girls receive equal attention as boys. Even Clara Becker, the widow who had been assaulted, discovered that the Americans did not forget her case. She was provided medical care, and when her attacker was sentenced by court-martial, news of the punishment spread quickly. The contrast with stories from the East could not have been starker. Refugees continued to arrive, hollow-eyed and broken, carrying testimonies of Soviet atrocities. Women violated by the dozens, homes stripped bare, whole families left destitute. To hear such accounts while living under American discipline only reinforced the sense that Heidelberg had been spared a different fate. Greta could not help but draw comparisons beyond Germany. In conversations with officers, she learned about the American presence in Italy and even in Japan. In both places, similar principles were unfolding: discipline, restoration, and reform. Though adapted to each context, the Americans, it seemed, were attempting something radical in the history of war, an occupation that sought not to perpetuate hatred, but to prevent it from taking root again. For Greta, this realization carried personal weight. Her younger brother had died on the Eastern Front. His last letter filled with fanatical slogans about German destiny. She now wondered, had he lived to see this? Would he have believed it? Could he have accepted that the very enemies he died fighting were capable of rebuilding the country he thought invincible? By autumn, the signs of transformation were everywhere. Markets reopened. Public lectures returned at the university. Stripped of ideology, local elections were planned elections in which, for the first time in years, candidates could speak without swearing loyalty to the Reich. More astonishing still, women would be allowed to participate as voters, a right suppressed under Hitler's rule of control and conformity. In the Miller apartment, the women gathered on evenings not to whisper in fear, but to talk of the future. Their conversations shifted from survival to possibility. Could Heidelberg one day thrive again? Could Germany be more than ruins and shame? Could they, as women, claim roles in shaping that future? Greta listened, sometimes in disbelief, sometimes with a cautious smile. She remembered the candlelit night when Anna swore the Americans would reveal their true faces. Perhaps they already had, and the truth was more complicated, more human than fear or propaganda had ever allowed. The occupation of Heidelberg did not erase the pain of war, nor did it erase loss, but it reshaped what defeat could mean. For once, the conqueror had not chosen vengeance. Instead, he had chosen order, restraint, and against all expectations, a path toward partnership. And in that unexpected turn lay the seeds of something history had rarely seen before. Enemies on the battlefield beginning the slow, fragile journey toward becoming allies in peace. By the spring of 1946, Heidelberg no longer resembled the trembling city that had awaited its conquerors in silence. The streets were alive again with the clatter of carts, the chatter of markets, and the ringing of church bells. The scars of war remained bomb craters, missing windows, blackened stone, but life moved forward. Greta stood in line at the polling station that April morning, her heart fluttering with a mixture of disbelief and pride. Around her were women of every age, mothers clutching toddlers, grandmothers leaning on canes, young women with determination in their eyes. They were here not as silent companions of men, but as citizens, ready to mark ballots for the first free election in their lifetimes. An American officer at the doorway stood watch, not as a master but as a guardian. Safe passage, he assured the crowd in broken German. Everyone votes. No trouble. When Greta stepped inside the station, she paused, fingers brushing the edge of her ballot. She thought of the night a year earlier when Sergeant Thompson had knocked at her door and she had opened it with trembling hands. Expecting ruin, she thought of Anna's fearful whispers, of Marie's cautious hope, of Clara's suffering, of the ration lines and the public trial that had stunned the city. She thought of the women in her apartment, who had transformed from victims in waiting to participants in civic life. And she thought of how an occupying army, an army with every power to dominate, had instead chosen restraint, discipline, law, and dignity had replaced vengeance. It had not been perfect, nor without tragedy, but it had been different. When she placed her ballot into the box, Greta felt tears sting her eyes. This small act, so ordinary in peacetime, was extraordinary in its meaning. It was proof that Heidelberg had survived not only destruction, but despair. Proof that fear could give way to trust. Proof that history could, against all expectation, take a new path. Months later, when American units began rotating out of Heidelberg, the departure was marked not by sighs of relief, but by quiet farewells. Civilians waved at convoys. Children clutched candy wrappers they had been given by soldiers who would soon be gone. Greta herself stood at the roadside, watching as trucks rumbled past. When Sergeant Thompson passed by, he caught her eye, lifted his hand in a simple salute, and disappeared into the dust of departure. For Greta, it was the closing of a circle. The man she had once feared as a predator had become, in memory, the face of something unexpected. An army that had chosen to behave with humanity in the midst of power. In later years, historians would point to Heidelberg and cities like it as symbols of a different kind of occupation, one that did not sow the seeds of hatred, but planted the fragile roots of democracy. They would trace a line from those ration stations and public court-martials to the later alliance between the United States and West Germany, forged not in fear, but in the shared rebuilding of a shattered continent. Greta did not need books to tell her this. She had lived it. She had seen terror turn to trust, suspicion to cooperation, and despair to hope. Looking back, she often reflected on the irony. History remembered armies for their victories in battle, for their conquests and campaigns. Yet in Heidelberg, history remembered an army for something far rarer, its restraint. And in that restraint lay the beginning of friendship.